Okay, so our five panelists today, born in Lokano, Karinya, and Akaweo lands in Georgetown, Guyana, Afuwa has lived and worked on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations for 2 decades. She's a former arts editor and finance coordinator of the Capilano Review and is the associate director at 221A Artist Run Center Society. Her practice as an artist and arts worker unravels colonial legacies of location and embodiment. Gage Diabo is a Mohawk scholar from Kanawage. They worked as an assistant director on APTN's comedy series Mohawk Girls and as a panelist and coordinator for the 2016 and 2017 editions of CBC Montreal's Turtle Island Reads event series. They recently completed their PhD at the University of British Columbia, specializing in First Peoples literature, and are beginning a postdoctoral fellowship at Concordia University in Montreal. Yay, so happy to have you there. Megan Feheley is a Moose Cree interdisciplinary artist based in Toronto. They are currently working towards their BFA in Indigenous Visual Culture at OCAD University and work predominantly in experimental sculpture and installation, beadwork, textiles, painting, and video. Jastej Luddu recently completed a master's degree in social and political thought at York University. He's the communications and story producer for 221A, a Vancouver-based arts nonprofit. He lives and works on the traditional territories of the Semiahmo, Katzie, Coquitlam, Kwantlen, Kakite, and Tsawwassen First Nations. Fenn Stewart reads and writes on unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories. She's regular faculty in the English department at Douglas College and occasional faculty at UBC, and a former editor of the Capilano Review. Fenn's poetry publications include Better Nature, which is from Book Hug in 2017. Her most recent work includes an article in Briarpatch about Miwasing and a post on the Ecologies blog about decolonization and the end of the world, both with Jastej. So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. And I just wanted to say it's such a fantastic issue. I'm so excited to be able to celebrate it with you. And definitely, I think it's an issue that spoke to a lot of people in its concept. And I know that as editors, you had a very, very difficult job because you received just an overwhelming number of submissions from the open call. So just wanted to talk a little bit about the editorial framework of this issue today, talk about some of the practices that were involved in the making of this issue. And maybe just to start, I guess, is just to think about how you guys framed the call for this issue, which is this idea that that bad feelings might actually be good for us or good to us in a way, in that they can act as catalysts for change or building solidarity. And so the call for submissions was sort of framed by this quotation from one of Gage's previous essays, which was titled Bad Feelings, Feeling Bad, the Affects of Asian Indigenous Coalition. And the quotation read, "Negative affect, or what Sian Nai calls ugly feelings, ought to be taken seriously as both an unavoidable presence and a potential catalyst in and for active solidarity." So just as an opening question, I guess, for the 3 editors, Afuwa, Fenn, and Jastej, why was the theme of bad feelings important to you as editors, and how did you settle on this idea as a kind of guiding curatorial concept for this issue?
I think for myself, bad feelings have always been very important, I think, in my reading and writing and research. And my initial wrestling with it was arguing with Fenn about their validity, and that made for some good conversations about the usability or productivity of anger, resentment, fear, worry, those sorts of things. And then Fenn sending me Gage's essay and seeing that there had been very serious work, ongoing work being done around the concept of bad feelings, especially from in people of color and Indigenous writers and theorists and artists. I think for myself, it seemed like a good centering point to sort of pin a whole issue around, because I think we're often very bad to our bad feelings they're often not taken seriously, or if they're taken seriously, it's only to dismiss them or move towards some sort of catharsis or a place where we're feeling good, which for me is not as interesting as just sort of sitting with them. So for myself, I think bad feelings still remain like very important, and I thought it would be interesting as well to hear from other people, to just for them to read our call, and obviously it spurred some good work, some great work, many submissions that were difficult to decide what to bring in and what to leave out. So again, want to thank everyone who submitted, even if it didn't end up being in the issue. I think we got a lot of stuff that we weren't thinking we would get, and also stuff that was exactly what we were thinking we would get. So yeah, it was interesting. I don't know, Fenn, if you want to pick it up from there.
I sort of went back and forth because we were in the middle of the pandemic, and I was just like, if we do this, are we the problem? Is it us? But I also felt that it was necessary to address the ways in which those actually not running away from problems and issues can lead to solidarity and solutions, and it was just something that I personally and I think we all three had those discussions about like how to actually hold this issue in a good way, in a righteous way. Fenn?
Yeah, it's funny because even though we started thinking, like Jastej and I were working on the blog post that was mentioned in my bio. So it was a blog post which somehow was published in the Ecologies blog, which focuses on like early modern nature poetry. And somehow Jastej and I convinced them to publish a blog post that was about the apocalypse in the context of thinking through like anti-colonialism and anti-racism. I'm not sure how that happened. But anyway, we were working on this blog post, and we were arguing about this movie that Jastej was really into and I refused to watch. And at that time, we were mostly thinking actually about like climate dread, and specifically the kind of ethics and politics around like who's dread, who has dread, who has other feelings, right? And I was at the time reading work by Kyle Powys-White, an Indigenous climate studies scholar, who, among other scholars, has been really critical of settler apocalypticism, which is briefly white people freaking out about climate change and going, oh my God, the world's coming to an end. Everyone, I just got scared. I just got worried. Things are bad. And so we were arguing about this movie, and we were arguing about the different kinds of dread that people feel and how they can be politically useful and how they cannot be politically useful. So settler apocalypticism is, considered to be like an unuseful form of dread by many scholars. Of course, not everyone has the same take on it. And that was sort of, how I started thinking about bad feelings. Obviously, the issue ended up considering a whole range of different kinds of bad feelings, right? Of course, there was some like climate dread of various kinds. Like I don't mean that in a, I don't mean like the problematic kind of climate dread that I personally am not super interested in, but like a range of different kinds of feelings about climate, obviously, and the environment and so on. But Jastej was always like pushing me and saying like, no, you shouldn't be like so quick to dismiss feelings of like dread or despair or whatever, because for me, I tend to be like, oh, dread and despair are often not very productive. They can often be really like, they can have kind of like reactionary implications. Like, of course, this is hugely contextual and really depends on like the position of the person who's expressing their dread and their despair and what they're doing with it, right? So that was sort of the start of thinking through bad feelings. And then after we'd been having these conversations for a while, doing this issue came as sort of like one of the branches of our, ongoing sort of work, thinking through different kinds of bad feelings and different kinds of forms of like organizing or resistance or, anti-colonialism, anti-racism, anti-various kinds of apocalypse kind of work, and how bad feelings come into that. So yeah, sitting with them for sure, but also doing things with them, right? Both of those, not just the like sitting with, and that's also something that comes out of, I think, Gage's essay, which maybe Gage you can speak about perhaps later on if you want to, but the context of that that essay of yours that we found that quotation in, right? That article is also about doing stuff, right? Doing stuff with bad feelings, as well as just like letting them sit with oneself.
And just to add, I've put the movie in the chat for all the people who are going to watch it and realize that I was right and Fenn was wrong to not watch it. So, yeah.
Yeah, that seems like a good place to go. I want to pick up on this idea of, you know, sitting with or not running away, or this question of Afua, you said, of like how to hold on to those feelings, how to be gentle and sit with those feelings. And one thing that really strikes me about this issue is the way that the different pieces sort of waver between those two approaches, between like, you know, that kind of stilling effect of just like being present with one's feelings and not having to have necessarily a kind of action tied to it. And then also like seeing them as ways of mobilizing equity work or community building, reform, you know, all these sorts of like solidarity building exercises. And Gage, you know, I did want to ask you, so in your reading of Alexi's novel, it really, like this reading seems really cut through with this kind of duality of like impasse on the one hand, and then also impulse, this sort of like impulse to keep going or to move forward or to sort of like transmute those bad feelings into something new. So I just wanted to ask you, and maybe also the other participants, like, you know, what you think about this sort of balance between stillness and action that bad feelings asks of us.
Thank you. First of all, shout out to Paul Schrader, director of First Reformed, the great film that Jastej has recommended for us. Check it out. Also, shout out to Gahande Horn-Miller, fellow Kanyegaha scholar, whose writings on balance and distortion in the Haudenosaunee tradition have really shaped my own intellectual work and my own day-to-day life now that I think about it. Where in going back to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe creation stories, where you have the right-handed and left-handed twins, Dehuranyawagu and Suiskida, who are these competing but also complementary forces of destruction and creation in the universe. The wisdom we take away, or the wisdom that Horn-Miller encourages us to take away from that narrative, is that we do have to seek to strike a kind of balance between those two impulses, those two forces that prey upon our minds, but also prey upon how we in our embodied lives interact with the world around us. And so I guess part of what I've been trying to reconcile when I think about bad feelings, even to this day, is what is by and large a kind of normative stigmatization of what gets called bad feelings, negative affects, or however you want to name them. With my own sort of inundation in those same bad feelings, like I've been clinically depressed for about as long as I can remember. I've also grown up in a very of Ganawage. Mental illness runs in my family, so I've inherited a lot of cause for bad feeling, you know, through no fault of my own. And yet in the Haudenosaunee tradition, the same tradition that I'm trying to draw from and learn from, we also stigmatize bad feelings to some extent. You know, Wendy Hill writes in her book, Peaceful Relations, which I checked out last summer around the time this issue was coming together. She makes the very valid point that if you dwell with your bad feelings for too long, if you let them simmer away for as long as possible, there is a very good chance you're going to make yourself sick. And I've been sick. I've been there and I've felt that. And so to consider what my relationship is with that potential for sickness, but also that potential to heal from that sickness at the same time, has been a preoccupation of how I have turned my bad feelings into the stuff of critical practice and the stuff of engagement with the world. It's very easy, and it's been, you know, almost encouraged of us in the pandemic and post-pandemic times to sort of draw inwards and wrestle with our own selves and wrestle with a lot of the bad feelings that have come to define us. And then at the end of the day, do we remain inside or do we turn back outwards? to our peers, to the environment, and to the land. I don't know. I'm trying to get to that point. Anybody else want to follow up?
I think that was great, Gage. Thank you. I think maybe picking up on that, the drawing inward versus moving outward thing is super important, because I've not unlike many of Paul Schrader's films, which deal with white men who journal and write in little cubbies and like have all their bad feelings sort of internalized before some spectacular violence at the end of the film. I think there is like this understanding, that conventional understanding that bad feelings mean people draw inward and don't find community or find solidarity. Yesterday I was at a special screening of How to Blow Up a Pipeline, this new movie that's out, in a room full of people who felt bad about the climate emergency. Probably, maybe some of them were just Vancouver Sun critics, but like a bunch of these people who are feeling bad in certain ways about the world in which we live in, and they're going out and considering their feelings in a public space with other people, having conversations with people about those things. Obviously, we'll need more than just movie screenings to fix the world, but I think there's something to be said about community building, or public facing, whether it's protests or sit-ins or teach-ins, things of those kinds, that they do use bad feelings. It's a productive use of those feelings. But it is difficult. It is hard. I think it is difficult to move from that space of where you're just feeling those feelings on your own, and then you recognize them in other people, and then you make the step to communicate and talk to those people. So it's a difficult process, but a worthy one, I would say.
Yeah, and for me, like, I feel like what Gage is saying about like not being in stasis with it, that was what really excited me about Megan Feheley's work, and that like using their grief as a tool to externalize this emotion, and like literally using tarpaulin, which is this temporary but like very durable protection. I don't know, I just found it was like to imagine what that process is like, I think a pale consideration to what it was like really like. If you want to speak to that, Megan?
I think when we consider like that space, especially in art making, between stillness and action and sitting with negative affect, I know like in my work, I've operated often from a space of like constant anxiety and uneasiness. It does allow me to process things or to expand upon them in a way I don't think many other spaces offer. I do think that negative affect is something that we can pathologize or judge or let color our lives in a certain way. And I try, as someone who works from like a position of constant anxiety, to maybe work to befriend them. Befriend might not be the right framework, or at least offer a generous self-understanding that bad feelings are a way that we recognize like our limits and our desires when boundaries are crossed, or when something significant has happened to us. Maybe it's a minor or like an all-encompassing wrongness that has like descended on our lives. And I think my work is often colored by understandings of haunting. I recently reread Tuck and Ree's A Glossary of Haunting, which has informed my work heavily over the years. And that idea of a thing sort of taking on this process of continually rearing its head and having to like express itself but not be resolved is really important, I think, to like my understanding of negative affect and how it operates in my work. I think that it can be not easy, but it can be like a constant urge to try to find like a resolution where none may exist in our like tangible reality. And I try as an artist to like remind myself, especially when I'm like lost in a work, that my job isn't necessarily to resolve anything or to answer anything. My job is to question and theorize and like posit things in the art making space, where that's the space I get to work in. I'm not really an academic. I'm not really a writer, but like the art making sphere is where I can probe things. In hopefully a generative way. And I think maybe generative is a little different than resolution.
Yeah, thank you all so much for that. I have like a lot of percolating questions about, what happens when we turn bad feelings outward. And like, I just, I'm picking up on something that you said, Jastej, about like being in the movie theater and that there's like, you're sitting among others, but there's no sort of guarantee of fellow feeling, and so like, I think maybe leading to a question of, when we say bad feelings, like maybe my bad feelings aren't the same as your bad feelings, or like, just that the idea of designating anything as good or bad relies upon a certain acts of interpretation that are, of course, like shaped by our enculturation or shaped by our personal experiences. And so that there's no necessary sort of like guarantee on which affects or situations or responses will kind of connect. So just as like a very general sort of question, I wanted to ask you all, like how do we define the badness of bad feelings? Like what are those, what constitutes a negative emotion in the context of the work that you've assembled?
If I could, something I think about a lot because I have small kids is I'm thinking a lot about like feelings in kids often, because kids often have a different relationship to expressing their feelings than sometimes older persons. And a generational shift, at least within like my cultural context, when I was a kid, there was more of a probably a cultural tradition of saying like, oh, don't cry, or oh, don't be sad, think on the, whereas now the advice that I'm getting from persons who are working on these things right now, right, is like you're supposed to like validate feelings, right, which honestly for someone who's like 38 is pretty much a brand new idea, like from my cultural context, that someone is in bad shape and you're supposed to go like, I hear that you're having a really bad time, and not try to like distract them, or and I understand that this is not a new idea to everyone, it just happens to be a new idea to me, relatively. And so I think that's really like generative too, right? Because the question isn't always just like, do you already share someone's bad feelings? It's like, what can you like learn or develop or offer someone by just like hearing about a bad feeling that you didn't have before, So, and this was something too, right? Like, I know with Afuwa's concern about the issue at first, when we pitched it to her, we're like, oh, like work on this with us. And she's like, I'm kind of into it, but I'm a little bit worried, because it is politically and ethically complicated to talk about one's own bad feelings in public, to ask other people to talk about their bad feelings, right? If you're doing a research project and you want people to talk about their bad feelings, that's considered a risk, like an ethical risk to your subjects, right? So, and also, in the middle of the pandemic, and in terms of, all the things that people feel bad about that other people might not feel, whatever, it's very complicated, it's very contextual, it's very sensitive. And so I think, yeah, I'm not sure that's a useful answer, but I guess what I wanted to get at was just the idea of like listening to other bad feelings that you might not have yourself, and that you might not have been able to anticipate until someone else articulates them to you. And that can be like just in and of itself a really powerful gesture between people that are in different places, whether it's generationally or, in terms of any of the other myriad ways that we are in different places from one another.
Yeah, and I think in terms of that sort of like the value judgment or how we parse bad feelings. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine online, Maral, about the closing of Roxham Road. And, we were talking about preventable hells like terrible things happen, right? Loss happens, pain happens, but when things are preventable, when they are entirely within other human beings' power to solve, to ameliorate, it's a special kind of like acid that eats into your soul. And I feel like that, like, even like in retrospect, because I mean, I had this conversation this week, it helped me like frame part of this issue. Yeah.
Apologies, because I know some people already heard this story before, because I tell it all the time. But my first, Fenn mentioned, our blog post about dread, and dread was the first like bad feeling that I really considered, specifically because I was on this class trip in England, in London, and the concept of the whole course was that we were tracking and following like Indigenous travelers' visits to the UK in London, and thinking about, for example, like different Indigenous peoples visiting the Queen, and on behalf of their nations. And so we were in England for like a week, and we got like a black walking tour of London. We visited these horrible museums. Never visit a museum in London if you like, just avoid it. And I felt all these bad feelings that I'd never felt before, because I was walking around looking at statues of just horrible people just all across the city, or streets with, if you've been to England, that they have these little blue memorial markers all over the city where like famous people have lived, and most of them are horrible people, with the possible exception of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And it's not very fun going on an educational trip in England if you're someone who thinks about racism and colonialism. And I came back from that trip thinking about how I'd felt dread, which I thought was funny, because dread, typically you feel dread about something that is going to happen, like in the future. But I was feeling dread about all these things that had already happened, like way before my time. And I was thinking about, that was my first real like grappling with and trying to define an idea. And part of it, I know Fenn mentioned like the idea of like listening to other people's bad feelings, but I don't think you only do that when you want to learn about something new, but also when you want to see avenues for solidarity and see how your bad feelings are actually not that different from other people's bad feelings. That's not to mean that my struggle is the same as someone from the global South, or an Indigenous person in this country, but the idea that I can empathize with someone who is having a bad time or is angry at the same thing that I'm angry at. I think that was very powerful, at least for me, to undergo that experience. And of course, going back to Canada and realizing we have all our own street names and all our own statues in the great province of British Columbia. It was quite eye-opening for me, realizing first how many bad feelings there were, but then not feeling like overwhelmed by that, I think was also important. Like not withdrawing, not hiding from that, but being like, okay, these I'm feeling bad, and that's okay, and I can do something with that instead of shutting up or withdrawing inward.
I always feel a bit patronized too when someone doesn't think that bad feeling or affect is like a productive place to make work from. I feel like maybe in those discussions, there's like this persistent thread of, why can't you ever just be happy, or why can't you ever just see the good in something? If I knew. And I think that insisting on only recognizing good affect or good feelings can be used in the service of forgetting. Not that like misery or bad affect is any less seductive, but making work or seeing things from a place of bad feeling does not like negate the revolutionary power of joy, yada, yada, yada. But it does feel false to me to ignore bad feeling. And I'm always like suspicious of a utopian view. Utopia has always kind of come at the cost of something. I've been reading a lot of Ahmed and her discussions of how happy objects are maintained, and how they always come at the cost of someone else's either silence or complicity in their own silencing. So I think our discomforts and our upsettings are also something that can be tended to, and maybe the reverse of misery or bad affect being a seductive force is that good feeling can cloud your vision. You know, I as an artist have ignored like my most honest and most accurate instincts because of good feeling, or trying to like insist on approaching things from a place of good feeling. And I just like keep returning in my work to a place of sometimes beauty can be a form of forgetting. Sometimes it is a form of erasing truth or things that have like occurred. That's what you talking about reminded or made me think of, Jastej.
Yeah, I remember years ago I was sitting with like a kind of big ball of grief, and I read something in like one of those like little skinny like Buddhist handbooks that said the root of suffering was running away from pain and towards pleasure, and it allowed me to accept the grief as a measure of the love of the person that I had lost. And it really, it helped me to give it a form and a shape that wasn't something to run away from, but that was actually a mirror image of that love. So yeah. Okay, I'm verklempt. I have nothing left.
Gage, did you want to speak to sort of interpreting or parsing the badness of bad feelings?
I suppose there's, from the responses that have come before me, thank you for all of that. Something that's occurring to me is that there's a very strange kind of timeline at play when we name things as bad feelings. And I wonder now, like, because we're also throwing around the term apocalypse and grief and melancholia at the same time, I wonder if instead of like just a linear timeline from you're in a bad place and then you want to end up in a better place, which we can interpret as utopian or post-apocalyptic somehow, that instead, when it comes to our day-to-day, moment-to-moment emotions, that rather the timeline is in fact circular, that we do come back to bad feelings from time to time, whether actively or sometimes through other people's actions. I think that kind of bears out in the way that we engage with the media and the ways in which media engage with us at the same time. Like, we love horror movies. People love sad music at the same time. There is kind of an impulse to return to the scene of these feelings that normatively or just literally make us feel bad. Why would we do that? Why would we pursue the self-destructive route? That seems counterintuitive, but I think there's something to that counterintuition at the same time that can be at the same time the site of togetherness. Like, one of the happiest memories in recent times for me has been seeing Scream 6 in the theater in New York City with a very, very rowdy crowd who was like cheering and screaming and yelling at the screen at all the right moments. And yeah, we go into a movie like Scream expecting to be entertained, but that entertainment also comes with a lot of different flavors to it. A little bit of heartbreak, a little bit of dread, and a little bit of catharsis, if we want to go Aristotelian for a second. And all of that in the end we come out of the theater feeling some kind of collective joy, or at least some kind of solidarity. I don't know what to call it at this point. And I think that's powerful. And that's something that I hope again comes through in the work that's being shared in this edition of the Capilano Review as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think for me, that trajectory isn't circular, but a spiral, because you may go back to the same place, but the time is different and you are different. So it's familiar, but also you have also transformed since you have gone through other states of emotion and being. And I feel that, so-called bad feelings, they give us a breadth of who we are. Because if you only know someone when things are, going great, then you don't actually know that person. Because the true test of how we express ourselves is when you are not in place, you are not, you're not fully rooted and grounded and stable. It's like, what direction do you spin in? And I feel like those, like, to visit those places, and not necessarily to stay, but to enter and leave with a certain amount of ease and understanding that you may come back, allows us to meet each other and to meet wherever in the spiral other people are, and to go, I am actually not there, but I've been to that town, I've got the t-shirt, and here's who I can be in this moment.
Yeah, I love what you said, Afua, Gage, too, like this sort of picture of the spiral. Because I remember I do a lot of work in archives and interviewing, and the idea of like going back to the archive and realizing that we're having the same conversations about the same topics over and over and over again, but the hopefulness of it shifting incrementally, even that we're having them in a slightly, like in a different time. So I guess one of the things that I want to ask, because so much of this seems like, I wanted to go back to that quotation from the editor's note, this idea that a burden shared is a burden halved. And just thinking about like the role of sharing and listening. And we have so many contributors from the issue, like in the audience here too. So I would love to hear anybody's perspective on this in the chat as well. This idea that like, when you like with this, what role art and writing and composing plays in this, in like extending something outside of ourselves to make a sort of moment of contact with somebody else, that can be a means of kind of like connecting on or processing or possibly even healing negative affects, or like not healing negative affects, but like developing a different relationship to our negative, our bad feelings. So I did want to put that out there to all of the makers, to just ask, like, what that role of listening, receiving, sharing, like what the political work, or maybe even like sort of like soul work or spiritual work of that sharing is.
I think, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for all the like art and writing that I read about other people going through or dealing with bad feelings. Like, to know that it's possible to even do that, was a bit of a revelation for me. it's sort of, it's the also the slightly egotistical thing, right? Like when you're very, very young and not getting older every day person like I am, when you can see that people have done things that have dealt with your types of feelings before you, before you, that's very inspiring, I think. And yeah, I think how you phrase it, Deanna, is exactly right. You know, this making contact. You know, reading Gage's piece, reading all the other pieces in the issue, and seeing people vocalize and illustrate and write about bad feelings in ways that I had considered or hadn't considered. It's a very dialogical process. Like it's very much a dialogue, and that is quite nice, because I think, again, like bad feelings being segregated or put in the place of like the lonely, solitary space where they're by themselves and all under the cupboard, under the stairs. Actually, they're very vocal. They actually deserve not just recognition, but retaliation, like in a good way. Like, I've read this, I'm going to respond to it. I've listened to this, I'm going to sing something back to it. It's very dialogical, I would say.
I'm thinking of, and so much of the work in here does that, right? Of course. Even just sending it in, like even the work that isn't in here, right? Like all the people who sent in their bad feelings that, for one reason or another, aren't here. But the anxiety handbook, this is on page 105, Bailey McCobb, and there's like things to do in your body, right? Take a deep breath from your diaphragm. You're doing so great, this little cat says. And then there's even literally like personal contact info. Reach out if you need help, right? So, a lot of the work in here does that in a maybe like in a more implicit way, but there's also just like literally like, here is some help for your body right now, which is kind of amazing. And yeah, the body aspect of it too, right? Like the embodied and body aspect of how to bad feelings can be painful, right? Like they can hurt our bodies. And like Gage was speaking about the different ways that we can hold bad feelings in ourselves, and how certain ways of holding bad feelings might not be healthy for one's body, right? So it's like not about ignoring them or rejecting them. Of course, ignoring and rejecting bad feelings can also be unhealthy for your body. So maybe that goes back to the balance that you were talking about, Gage, right? Like traditions of helping people hold things in a way that's like safe for their body.
Yeah, I think like bad feelings. We can make a bingo card for however many times we say it today. Put me in my body in like a very certain way, in a very particular bent, as it like interacts or collides with experiences and memories and desire and position. And I think like the most powerful moments in my life as a human or as an artist have been when I've been like screaming into the same void as someone else, or that allowed like me and another person to connect, to share or to receive or to listen. It reminds me how our voices are very expansive, especially in art spaces. And it reminds me of like that very like fundamental electricity that exists between people. And it's that part of making art in this way that like makes me want to keep living. And I think like for my work that's in this issue, it's very specifically about hope, or like the most honest thing about hope that I could make, being made during a time when I was experiencing like a very, very intense grief while alone, and being very like removed from being able to be in proximity with my family, and not being able to like go through the proper stages of grief. not being able to, attend a burial, or not being able to figure out how to grieve losing someone to COVID, in a moment where everything about COVID was so intense, and so difficult to live through, as it still is. But like, what I remember most about that time is not that, like, I don't remember the minutia, but I do remember every time someone even just said, I see what's happening, like that sort of like co-recognition with other people was what made me remember what it was about making work that returned me to my body, what it was about being human that returned me to my body, and not like just feel consistently like lost or floating or like unfixed in time. And I think trying to deal with all the aftermath of that grief and how it was being held in my body or by my family, I just felt like all this like bubbling up desire to say something that someone could speak back to me through. And the work like very purposefully uses like a question and an answer format for that reason. And like that sort of like coexistence or dialogue is, I guess, not how I was, or I guess it was how I was trying to seek some kind of catharsis. And also to just like keep screaming into the space of, during that time, we knew every day what was happening during the pandemic. At that time, we still had case counts and lists of the number of people who had passed away from COVID or had died of COVID. But no one that I saw, no one that I heard was talking about the experience of losing someone to COVID, or what the experience of grieving someone was like immediately. Like, it felt so viscerally lonely. So I think I'm off topic, but that's what I have.
I think this is like the most like personal issue I've ever worked on. Like, I don't think there is an off topic. It is all topic. It is all here.
Well, thank you so much for that. And I see that there's a comment from Dora in the chat, talking about like this idea that I also have realized that my bad feelings are very similar to those as I had it as a child. And at least the emotional and physical sensations are exactly the same, which is interesting to notice too. And then Rhoda, hi Rhoda, commenting like, bringing it back to the body, which I feel like, all of us as editors, or like, the sort of Capilano review side of the editors really had, there was like a real sort of physical sort of response in reading this collection and being present with it for so long, that I think was just like, both incredibly powerful and also totally exhausting. And I'm sure you felt that as well. But I think like it's really a testament to like how how powerful the personal connection to this work can be. So I really do thank you all for that. We are going to turn to a quick, maybe 15-20 minute Q&A in just a couple of minutes, but just to close out the sort of moderated discussion portion and to give people some time to think of any questions if they have them. Just wanted to close by asking the editors if there's anything that surprised you in editing this issue, between, because it was a long time in production, I think like well over a year. And so is there anything that sort of in your relationship to the theme as you had originally expressed it, is there anything that shifted or kind of changed over the course of editing this issue?
For myself, I would say, and I think we maybe addressed this a little bit in the editor's note. I think that Jastej and Afuwa and I had been thinking about bad feelings in terms of, at least certainly the way that we started thinking about it. We were more thinking about anti-colonialism and anti-racism and so on. And that was sort of what we had like in mind going in thinking about these conversations, particularly the ways that those like movements and ethics connect to like climate and environmental politics. But then a lot of the work that came in was focused on like health. And not that health is disconnected from those things, obviously it's not, but that some of the specific material that was sent to us was dealing with health in a more kind of like an individual body way and less a kind of like zoomed out kind of way. And I didn't expect that, which was maybe weird that I didn't, given that it's in the pandemic and COVID and, you know, so there was a lot of like really individual health stuff about like oneself or one's relatives and, you know, lack of access to healthcare and so on. And like really like internal, like the really kind of like internal, like interiority, like aspects of that, of like, you know, loneliness and not being able to access help and support and so on. And that was something that came up a lot that hadn't been, at least how I was thinking about it. Yeah, which is, again, it's not different, it's not outside, you know, it's not off topic at all, right? But it was a different sort of like way in to thinking about bad feelings than I had been thinking about it, at least personally, you know, which was more coming, you know, just gave the anecdote of being in London and looking at statues of, you know, British colonial, whatever, enter word here. So that, and the embodied experience of like looking at a statue that Jastej had at that moment in London, right? Like that was kind of, you know, so yeah, like a person's physical experience of their body or as a caregiver to someone else's body and not having the support to do that, like in terms of infrastructure, healthcare, et cetera. That was a surprising, like category, that's the wrong word, but of contributions that we got.
Yeah, I feel like the pandemic was really body focused because, you know, you had these like essential workers who weren't paid that much, but that their bodies were essential for, you know, labor to happen, for, you know, people to work from home and get Amazon deliveries, you know, for, you know, hospital staffing and janitorial services. And I feel like there was a certain amount of like removal from the body that was very classed. And it did feel very like discombobulating. And so, yeah, it kind of makes sense in retrospect that people start thinking about, you know, essential bodies and, you know, people who can interact with the world from, you know, they have, you know, bandwidth, Wi-Fi, they've got, you know, they can still, you know, make income passively or, you know, through their ideas, like through a sort of like a cerebralization of the body that people who don't have access to that privilege, you know, have to show up and be in danger and, you know, essentially cannon fodder in the race class pandemic war. But for me, I think it was mostly a laying of my own apprehension about doing this project, and that, you know, there's that, you know, that theory in music that, you know, when you have chords that are tuned the same, if you like play one string on a guitar and you've got like another one that's also tuned to the same chord, the chord that isn't played but that is tuned the same way will actually resonate from the sound waves. And it goes back to what Gage and Megan were saying about actually like not doing and experiencing and expressing these feelings in isolation, but that in a way, like I hate, like the word community is just excessively overused and essentially meaningless, but it's like the act of gathering these experiences and these creative works together just created an entirely different feeling for me. And I don't know that it was catharsis, like I wasn't healed, but I was transformed.
The issue is quite funny also, which you may not think if you haven't read it yet and we've been depressing you for the past hour, but like it's actually quite funny. Like I'm thinking of Alexis's piece, but it's like not, you know, laugh out loud funny. It's not like a riot, but it's sort of there is humor. Like Michael's poetry, Scott's piece, even Claire's piece as well. Dora's thing is so cute, like cute, but not like in a, you know, like aw, but like it's like nice to look at. And what I mean is I was surprised by that because I don't know, maybe I don't know what I thought initially, but yeah, maybe because as Fenn mentioned, thinking about anti-colonialism and anti-racism, maybe I thought, well, there would be no room for humor there. But even within my like in my interviews with Paneet and Andy and Megan Linton, like there are like jokes there. There's like all this humor there. Okay, good, cute, intentionally cute. Okay, good. But yeah, no, I think that was also surprising for me that it would be as sort of there'd be this undercurrent of humor, which I appreciated because it turns out, I don't know, maybe you need that in order to talk about bad feelings for as many pages as we did. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely like there was a lot of joy present in sharing bad feelings as a reader, I think. So and the humor played a large part in that. So I guess I'll open it up to any questions that the audience might have. And thank you so much for this like incredibly rich discussion. It's just been such a pleasure to hear your thoughts on this wonderful issue. I'll just have a look in the chat here. Case 4 writes, making work that returned me to my body, Megan Feheley, and then the act of gathering Afuwa. So the return to the body facilitates the gathering. Maybe a question about like, I'm sorry for my bad reading here. A question about the role of the body in all of these sort of, you know, in bad feelings.
I mean, I feel the whole like mind-body separation is just like Cartesian bullshit. Can I say bullshit? But it's like the brain doesn't actually differentiate between physical pain and emotional pain. It just goes like, oh, pain. And if something, and I think Gage was talking about this, and basically just like paraphrasing everything Gage said, but it's like if you experience something, it also lives in your body as well as your psyche. So like I feel like we're always returning and having to return to those states of being and remembering. So yes and no, I guess. All of the above.
Yeah, there's so much there, right? In terms of how things are stored in the body and what happens when we like pay attention to those feelings, like doesn't necessarily shrink them, can make them worse, can like, you know, can make them feel worse, even if ultimately it's a good idea, you know? I had occasion to read like a book about how to live with chronic pain like recently, and it was really interesting because it was all about how if you're if your mind is afraid, your body will be in pain, even if you are not in danger, like, you know, objectively in that moment. So when people, for example, are like healing from an injury, your body will become afraid for itself. And it will be like, we're in pain still, we're in pain still. But then, you know, the people that are like therapeutically helping you might be like, no, but actually you have to walk on that, you know, post-surgery, you know, your body, part of your body is telling you, curl up in a ball, do nothing. But actually, you know, your body maybe needs you to move. So something about like the ways in which our pain is telling us the truth, but then also sometimes our pain might lead us to do something that isn't ultimately what our entire organism complexly non-Cartesianly needs, you know? That's not at all helpful. But that's just what that made me think of, like and I guess this goes back again to Gage, what you were talking about before, right? How do you hold stuff in your body in a good way? You know, I like in a, I don't know, good and bad now, or like, you know, you say the words too much and they have no meaning, but what, you know, in a healthful way, I don't know.
And I think that's why you share it, right? So that other people can be like, actually, when you curl up in a ball and do this, it's kind of like, it's better if you like have a shower and floss, you know? And that's why we share it, you know, like they say, pain is inevitable, suffering is optional, you know? And so it's like to remember, like, have a shower, floss. It's just the little things that remove you from that spot and keep you on that ever turning spiral of being yourself. And I think Dora had a question.
Yeah, I'll just say it, I guess, instead of typing it. So yeah, it's more about the editorial process, and to give context, I'm a new editor. I'm starting as the poetry editor of Prism. I go to UBC in the MFA. Thanks. Yeah, I'm super excited. But yeah, I haven't done like much editing at all. And I was just curious. I think like this issue theme was so cool. And I also loved the weather one like a year or two ago. And I just feel like it seems like you have a really great process, or I'm curious about the process about like choosing the themes and how, I don't know, they just seem like very generative and like very specific, but like very broad at the same time, like can hold so many different types of stories. And I feel like that's something I want to try and do too. So yeah, any very broad question, but if anyone has thoughts about that.
I mean, I would say is also like a relatively new editor, and it may seem counterintuitive, but I think Gage has given us the all clear on being counterintuitive, so I'm happy for that. Honestly, I think you can make like the call should be something that's important to you and personal to you, like almost too personal. Like, you know, like bad feelings are very, very personal for me, and along with Fenn and Afuwa, we made that the call like for a magazine. Like I actually think I mean, sure, I'm sure there's some calls that maybe would be too quote unquote narrow, but I think that's also like just like a mistake. I think thinking about whether things are too narrow or too broad is not even important. I think if it's important to you, it's going to be important to like 100,000 other people, and they're going to write in. Personally, that's what I think. Like, I won't say that I didn't have, you know, some fears about, oh, what if bad feelings is too, you know, whatever, but then it turned out not to be. And similarly with other calls that TCR has done, I think they do strike a good balance between too broad or too narrow, and people end up contributing work. So what's important to you should be in that call, I think. Yeah, that's my feeling on it. But again, I'm a relatively new to the editing game myself, so I might be making that all up.
Fenn or Afuwa, did you want to weigh in on that at all?
I think I'm like 100% behind the young whippersnapper. And yeah, I feel like if if you don't care about it, it's not like editing isn't always fun. Like there's some parts that are like beautiful and scintillating and brilliant. And then there's other parts where you're like, this is the 13th time we're going over this like piece of work, and you need that fire to sustain you. Like you need like that emotional lubricant that makes you want to make it so that when you put it out into the world, it is the best version of itself. So yeah, what Jastej said, yeah.
I'm also just remembering, I think around the same time that we had the initial idea to pitch this, it was to Matea at the time, who was in the position of accepting pitches at TCR. It was around the same time, and I was teaching all completely online because of the pandemic, and I teach usually first year, and I had given my first year students the option to write a personal essay, and we had been reading some very personal essays by including like Alicia Elliott and Erica Violet Lee and some other like contemporary Indigenous writers. And I gave my students the option to write a personal essay where you're connecting the personal and the political, you know, and they didn't have to write about something deeply painful if they didn't want to. They could, you know, they had an option, but it was one of the options that they had. And a number of them chose to write them, and a number of them chose to share them with the class. And I remember reading them, and I was talking to Jastej at the time, and he was like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "I don't know. I just read like 50 personal essays, and they were incredible. And they were also really hard to read. And also, I'm so glad that I read them. And also, I think I'm maybe not immediately okay. And also, my students are not, and everybody, you know, it was like really like who was it that was saying something about the electricity? Was that you, Afua? Were you talking about electricity? Oh, Megan, thank you. Yeah, the electricity that happens when people talk about things that really matter. So yeah, I think also, you know, like when I was a young person, we were sort of at that time, the people that I was writing and reading with, we had sort of this idea that we should not talk about ourselves, we should not talk about our feelings. We were trying to like live up to some idea of, you know, conceptualism that was often not very body focused, and we had some sort of anxiety around how we had to all be like clever floating Cartesian man brains. And yeah, I don't really feel like that anymore. And I'm really just interested in, yeah, personal things, feelings, you know. So I think in terms of editorial like pitches and when you ask people, yeah, you know, you ask people and you see if people want to share stuff with you, and then you have to shift in response to what you're getting as well, you know. That's a big one too, I think, right? It's like narrow enough so that you have a call, but wide enough so that things can come in that you wouldn't have anticipated, and then you shape the project in terms of what comes in and what really connects with you, and you build, you know, around that.
Great, thank you for that. Claire Malik has put like a series of really, really excellent questions in the chat. And I think I'm conscious that we're coming up on the end of time here. So maybe I'll just read some of these aloud as a point of contemplation. And then maybe after your responses to this question, we'll close. But Claire writes, I've been thinking this week about how writing, exploring bad feelings can be a kind of manual for the reader. How do you handle bad feelings? Where do they come from? What do you do with them? How do you feel them? So there's risk there, there's danger. And this sort of sparks that question of ethics that we talked about super briefly at the beginning of this talk. Then there's some thought that there must be responsibility as writers/artists exploring bad feelings to create communities of care through our writing on this topic. And of course, Bailey Macabra's work comes to mind here, like literally a manual for you know, as a long time sufferer from anxiety, you know. So I guess maybe something in there about like responsibility to a community and an audience, then, you know, sort of like the ethical question too. I suppose that's a really nice place to land.
Gage, do you want to speak to this at all? Just if you want to. I'm thinking about your piece and the issue, and whether this might be something
I suppose one of my contentions more about feeling more broadly, especially as it connects back to my interest in literature and media, is that yes, it does. These media and these narratives do function as a kind of instruction booklet for us to engage with our emotions, whether good or bad. But then they also give us kind of a rehearsal space to actually feel those things and feel what it's like to feel, as it were. And I'm not to get all like Shakespeare invented the human about this, but there is some, that is the power of arts and literature in my understanding of it, is that it gives us kind of a safe venue, as a risky venue nonetheless, but a relatively safe venue to try these things out for ourselves. And that notion of a rehearsal also makes me think of a book I've got back here by Simpson and Maynard about the abolition as a rehearsal for living. And I'm kind of caught up on this notion of rehearsing things and eternally preparing for things to come. And so I guess ultimately this all points us in the direction of the future, I suppose. I don't know where to leave off there, but to gesture at this possibility of a future.
Did anyone want to pick up on that briefly, or shall we end this event with a glance toward the future? I'll take that as the latter. Thank you all so much, so much for your time today, for your generosity, your incredible thinking, and especially for your hard work on this issue. And to everybody in the audience, thank you for your active listening, and thanks for being present with us and for your questions. Just wanted, before we sign off, just some acknowledgements. Of course, first, thanks to Afuwa, Fenn, and Jastej for their incredible hard work in bringing this issue to the world. Thanks to Gage and Megan for contributing work to the issue, and of course for joining us in the discussion today. Thank you to all of the contributors to the issue, many of whom are here today, and especially to all those who weren't in the issue but who submitted work and made the editor's job incredibly difficult. But thanks for making that extension and point of connection, which, as I think we've discussed today, is like the most important thing. So thank you for sharing of yourselves with us. Thank you to Jacqueline Ross, and Lauren Lavery, the respective art and managing editors at the Capilano Review, for their editorial work on this issue, and of course for bringing us the event today. And of course, thanks to our funders, the Canada Council for the Arts, BC Arts Council, the City of Vancouver, and the Vancouver Foundation, who helped us produce this issue, and for all of you for being here today. So yeah, thank you so much. Stay tuned for our next issue. Our next issue is on the theme interventions in the archive, doing that funny 90s thing where the TER is in parentheses, so inventions/interventions in the archive. Going to be a great issue, and that'll be coming out in the summer of 2023. So thank you so much.